Harkin Election SOS project for hosting. So I'm Terri Harel, the Executive Director of Online SOS. I'll tell you a little bit more about us in a second. But today we're going to talk about protection, response, and recovery to online harassment, specifically for journalists. And we'll also be talking about a bit of the background of how we got to this point in terms of the kind of level of harassment that we see today. So just really quick, Online SOS is a nonprofit organization, and we connect people with information and tools to take action in the face of online harassment. So you can go to our website, onlinesos.org, and we have lots of different resources from checklists to blog posts to support you in various types of online harassment situations, or in proactively protecting your digital presence. So like I said, today we're going to cover what is online harassment. So what is kind of the baseline that we're talking about and how did we get here? Prevention, response, and recovery basics. We don't have a ton of time in this session, so it'll be a bit high level. But I think the real meat of it will be kind of the response piece and how to use an action plan, which is one of our core tools. And then we'll go over some answers to FAQs, but also since we're such a small group, we can also just chat. If you have any specific questions that you want answered, I will do my best to provide an answer, or if I can't, direct you to a resource that might be helpful. So today, the key things, if you just leave with 3 things, it is 1, that online harassment is not your fault. You'll probably see this in every training or resource, blog post that you read about online harassment, but I just really want to emphasize that online harassment is not your fault. It's nothing that you've done. It is, and as we'll see in the upcoming slides, it is a behavior intended to harm individuals, and can also be very sophisticated operation. Then I also would love for you to leave knowing how to use an action plan. If you're faced with a particular online harassment situation, what are the tools available to you and how can you use them so that in these overwhelming situations, you're not just running around like, I have no idea how to get started. You'll have a place to go, and you'll already have an idea of kind of what you'll be looking at. And then finally, where to go if you need help. So good news is that there are actually lots of organizations, lots of groups that are working on this issue, and there is support out there for you. So I would love to leave you with kind of a list of resources of where you can find the support that you need in your particular situation. All right, so let's start with, what are we even talking about here? What is online harassment? So online harassment is, and this is going to sound like a little bit high level, but it's just an umbrella term for a set of harmful behaviors and tactics that are intended to do an individual or a group harm. Maybe we can just like type in the chat really quick, what are some different types of online harassment you've either witnessed, experienced, or maybe are concerned about. You can just type in the chat really quick. Or you can unmute yourself if you'd like.
I've definitely gotten harassment through Twitter quite often, and also through email. I guess that's one thing I had questions about, whether there's any good way to avoid that.
Sure. Thanks for sharing. Great. Yeah, so definitely email, use Twitter, Facebook. So what you're looking at here is, this is a framework that we developed for an in-depth report that we produced last summer on the current state of online harassment. And this is really looking at what are the components of the online harassment experience. And I know this is high level, but there's a reason why we're going through all of these pieces. And so bad actors employ various tactics of harassment through many mediums and across multiple locations to cause harm to targets. So the reason that I show this is I think once you kind of step back and you see all of the different ways that people are actually trying to cause harm to targets, it creates sort of a framework of like what the scope of the situation is. So, you know, bad actors can be anyone from a reader, an anonymous reader, to a paid troll. Um, these are some different tactics that we've, you know, you'll probably have heard about some of them. I mean, doxing, this is a big concern for journalists, having your private information shared without your consent. Stalking, sustained harassment, threats of violence, of course, vile, hateful comments, things like that. And they're delivered through many mediums. So I think like Jane shared, you know, through email or on Twitter, direct messages, even Venmo payment. You know, you could have a stalker pay you through Venmo. So what do you do about that? And through multiple locations. So people tend to experience harassment not necessarily in a vacuum of, oh, I just received this one Twitter comment, but these campaigns are actually taking place across multiple locations. And all of this causes great harm to the people that are targeted. And, oh, sorry. And that can include, you know, anxiety, damage to reputation, exclusion, and you know, definitely in the writing and journalism sphere, chilled speech, silencing, and maybe even exclusion from the journalism industry itself. And we'll come back to this in a couple minutes. So how did we get here? This is another kind of framework that we developed for this in-depth report. And I go through this again because it just shows that these tactics that are being practiced now have gone through a long history of being honed to create harm both to individuals and to groups. So these are like very sophisticated things that we're dealing with here. And this is also why I bring this up, because it just emphasizes that this is not your fault, this situation. So in the beginning, you know, even when we first started connecting computers in a network, people were already flaming one another, sending each other awful messages and emails, spamming emails so that you couldn't use your email, things like that. So this is kind of the, this is where someone is just a provocateur. They're trying to get a rise out of people. They're seeing what kinds of comments are making people emotional or getting under people's skin. You know, we even saw this in early message boards of the internet. So this is not unlike a person throwing a rock in a pond and trying to disturb the ecosystem, seeing what ripple effects happen. And I have to give a shout out to my colleague, Allison, who developed this wonderful analogy. The next level is, all right, maybe you were a provocateur, you kind of honed your skills. Well, how can I now use all of these things that I know how to do to get a rise out of people, get under people's skin? What are the most incendiary comments that I can make? How can I now use this to actually inflict harm on a particular person, on a particular target? So a now very high profile case that you might have heard about, Gamergate, started this way when a guy posted a blog post to inflict emotional suffering and reputational damage on an ex-partner. This is now known as the Zoe post. And this is something that quickly escalated into a coordinated campaign against many women, many individuals, and it became really a training ground for racist and misogynistic campaigns. And so that's where you get the development of kind of this next level. So tactics from campaigns like Gamergate, and again, this isn't to say that these tactics didn't necessarily exist before Gamergate. It was just, these are kind of the tactics that brought, Gamergate was a moment that really brought these into the mainstream. So tactics from campaigns like Gamergate were further honed and weaponized to target entire groups, communities, ideologies. So this is how kind of the social justice warrior, which, you know, at the beginning that sounds like a great thing, but it was actually turned into a rallying cry for the right wing and misogynistic and racist motivated campaigns. And this includes a campaign in which Black Twitter users were systematically impersonated and targeted in influence campaigns. This is this image here, your slip is showing. This was actually a campaign by many Black activists, female activists, to actually unmask what was happening. And finally, you know, these became some very infamous campaigns that we hear about now all the time in the last few years. All of the stories about bot farms, you know, in the lead up to the 2016 election and after, and certainly now we're hearing about them again. Hired troll mercenaries, they're using the same tactics that we saw in levels 1, 2, and 3, you know, these incendiary comments, racist attacks, coordinated campaigns, impersonation, etc., to sow division and influence entire social and political discourse at very large scales. And the reason, again, why I bring this up is just to highlight kind of the individual harms that this can start with. So anxiety, chilled speech, self-censorship, even physical violence, and connecting that to some of the broader harms and some of the discourse that we see within the media industry and, you know, as demonstrated even in this election, of course, this tense election cycle, at large, is reporters leaving the media because of chilled speech. You know, what's the point? Where is it worth it? Which reduces diversity of stories told. You know, the most targeted journalists are Black journalists, journalists of color, LGBTQAI plus journalists suffer more intense and more frequent attacks. And these are the voices that we need most. So this reduces diversity of the stories that we hear as a public, limits press freedom, can sow discord. It's more difficult to hold power to account. Sources might be reluctant to speak to a journalist because they're worried about harassment. And not to get like sound so over dramatic or anything like that, but I mean, this really kind of weakens the fabric of democracy. All right, so let's kind of leave some of that behind, but I think it provides a good basis of what I cover that information because I think it creates a good basis of what journalists are really dealing with, what level of sophistication, both in coordination of these types of campaigns against journalists, you know, the ideological attacks, as well as just showing that online harassment is not your fault. And I just want to set that baseline of kind of how we got to this moment and why it is so important to then have a focus on this prevention, response, and recovery. So prevention, what is the online harassment kind of timeline? It's not like the perfect word for it, but it's not really a cycle, it's not really a timeline, just where can you place yourself? Prevention is anything before an incident happens. So that might be you attend a digital security training, you improve your digital security or digital resilience, you attend a training like this, maybe you do a risk assessment with your editor before a story. Then, you know, because digital security and preparedness it's just a process, it's never going to be 100%, there may be some sort of incident. And then there needs to be some response or intervention. And there's two options during and after this response or intervention. Either the response or intervention isn't successful, and someone starts to self-censor and maybe even disengage or leave the industry entirely, or leave a social media platform. Or, and this is hopefully what we can do through successful interventions and trainings like this, where to go for resources, how we can support each other, is that journalists are able to process and recover and continue to engage. So the status quo, unfortunately, as I described before, in kind of these different levels of harassment and how we got to where we are, has been self-censorship or disengagement. But ideally, we're moving that status quo upwards. I mean, hopefully I could even make this box, I would like to make this box smaller, into more people having the support that they need to process and recover and continue to engage. All right, so prevention basics. Now that we know what kind of timeline we're looking at, let's talk about the preparedness piece. There's so much that can be covered in here, and you could do like 15 trainings just on digital security. But if I had to focus just on 4 things in the next week, it would be these 4 things. One is using a password manager like KeePass, Bitwarden, or 1Password. And thanks to Victoria from PEN America, I just learned that 1Password is actually free for journalists. So a password manager is really great because we all have this desire inside us to use the same password, because passwords are very difficult to remember, for every service that we use. But of course, that is not digital security best practice. It makes us very vulnerable to hacking and attacks. So the password manager uses a master password and then encrypts all of your other passwords for various services. Number 2, and this is so easy to do, is keep your software and operating systems up to date. So I always find this one funny because I actually used to get really annoyed with that little red dot that I would see with my Mac prompting me to update the operating system, and it would drive me bonkers because I'd say, well, I just updated. So the reason that this is so important is, software engineers might push a new feature update or something like that, and then later down the road, they find a security vulnerability that makes it easy for a hacker to get in there, for example. So they'll kind of quietly push a new update to fix that vulnerability, and that's when you get that little red dot, that notification of, hey, please update to version 6.5.3000. Which to us doesn't seem to mean much, but that is actually could be securing some vulnerabilities that were found. So it's super simple to do, and update, say yes to your Mac updates. Number 3, and I really can't emphasize this enough, for journalists or not journalists, really anyone, because I see it everywhere, is, and I think this answers one of your questions that you had, Jane, is weigh whether what you post includes identifying details about your location and routine. So as an example, one thing that I see often is people uploading their CV or their resume to their personal website or LinkedIn, which is great because of course that can be useful, but you open the PDF and it has their personal phone number, address, email, personal email, and then all of these personal identifying details about them are exposed without any work. So if you do need to upload something like that, maybe upload a version without that information. The other thing to be aware of, and this is even if you have your accounts locked down on private, is whether you have something in the background of a photo that you post to Instagram, for example, that shows where your location is. Maybe I can see like the street names in the background or identify a building or a business. And then also kind of giving people, dropping clues about a specific routine. Let's say you go for a run every morning and you post about it every single time. That's definitely something that someone could kind of pick up on and start putting together where you might be and when. So just something to be, there's no kind of like right or wrong. Of course, we all want to share about our lives and stay connected, but just something to be aware of. And then finally, dox yourself. So this can be quite overwhelming, Googling yourself or checking white pages, websites, data broker websites for your information. But it is a really important first step to finding out what information is out there, not just about yourself. And this is something that really surprised me when I did this, but also about the people that you care about. So when I found my information on some sites, it also showed me information about people I cared about. And that was a bit scary to see. So I would really recommend, and there is a whole thing that you could go into for this. And in the follow-up to this presentation, I've prepared a document with various links and resources, and one of them is doxing, how to dox yourself guide. So I really encourage you to check that out. Maybe you can sit with a friend and do it so it's not so overwhelming. But it's also something that you can kind of chip away at, maybe once a week or once a month, because something to know is that it can take several weeks to get some of the information off of these data broker sites. And there are paid services that do this for you as well. It just kind of depends, you know, how much you want to invest, time, money, etc. But definitely recommend it. And I just have to plug this because if you are interested in doing kind of a deep dive into the docs, like how to dox yourself and digital security, because we just don't have time to dive into all of those little pieces. Next week on October 7th, PEN America and Freedom of the Press Foundation are hosting a really great anti-doxing and digital security workshop, part of the Election SOS project. Super recommend it. All right, now we're kind of diving into the meat. So response basics, how to use an action plan. So if you remember from that kind of timeline chart, you've done the prevention piece, you doxed yourself, you tightened your digital security, you're careful about what you post, you're using a password manager, but there's an incident. What do you do next? You can use an action plan. So to give you a little bit of background, Online SOS, when we first started, we did provide direct service. So people were able to write into us explaining their situation, and we could do a one-on-one session with them. But as a tiny organization, that really wasn't something that could scale. So we said, okay, how can we take all of this knowledge that we've gained, this experience in these one-to-one sessions, and turn them into something actionable for people that need help whenever, so they don't even have to reach out to us one-to-one and wait for our response, for example. So we developed this tool called an action plan, and it's an easy to use checklist that walks you through the first steps of, hey, these are a few best practices to do in the immediate term, and then options to help you make the best decision for you. So something that we found in these direct service situations is, of course, online harassment is extremely overwhelming. You're not sure what to do first thing. So, hey, we can provide a couple best practices, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute. But that it was also super important for people to have options to choose what's best for their situation, because there's no one right response to online harassment. Every situation is very unique. If you think back to that rainbow chart, you could see, I mean, if you started mapping all of the different permutations, everyone's situation could be completely different and context. So it's really important for you to be able to also make the decision that's best for you and what feels right to you and what you're comfortable with. So that's why we designed these action plans this way. And if you go to our site, it's really easy to find them. There's this giant blue button. I think it's the only giant blue button on the homepage. and that will take you to the action plans. And there's actually kind of two groups. One is identifying, if you can identify what's happening to you in that situation, so what tactic of online harassment you're experiencing, so let's say doxing or mob harassment, then you can go directly to that plan. Or if you're looking for more kind of tactical preparedness plans, then we have ones on like digital security or documenting harassment, etc. Just something to keep in mind. All right, so how are the action plans laid out? As I said, they're checklists, and this is actually an important feature of these tools because in high stress situations, like an online harassment situation, let's say you're experiencing threats of violence or you've been doxxed, this actually creates a fight or flight response in our brains. And it can be extremely overwhelming, cause anxiety, not sure what to do next. And so we found that checklists are really great because you're just looking at kind of one piece of information at a time, helping you not forget important, potential important steps or consideration, things that you need to take into consideration. So that's why we've blocked it into these very easy to see, like, hey, these are things that you need to do now. Here are some things to consider after you've done those immediate steps, and other questions to consider. And we'll talk about each of these sections. All right, so now what are some things that you might want to do in the immediate, like someone has doxed you, for example, what should you take care of first? And this is really the only section I think that kind of has the same standard steps in it. They might vary like very slightly from action plan to action plan, but these are things to consider and take care of immediately. So those tend to be things like securing your physical safety. Is this an emergency situation? Are you in a safe place? Documenting the harassment. So this is really important. We'll go into this in a second, but making sure that you document the harassment before you report it, or else you might lose it, very important evidence. And let someone know what's happening. So this is, ties into securing your physical safety, but it's super important to know that you don't have to go through this alone. Like I said, online harassment is not your fault. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's really important to let someone that you trust know what's happening so that they can support you should you need it. All right, how am I doing on time? Okay. Documentation. I just wanted to do a couple in focus pieces to these various sections because there's a few that require a little bit more investigation, but I think they're super important. So documentation, like I said, always document before reporting to a platform because otherwise you might lose really important evidence. For example, someone sends you a veiled threat in a tweet or even an explicit threat in a tweet and then deletes it. So it's really important that you have an incident log of what happened as well as a screenshot. So screenshots, screenshot posts, download video or other media that you see, save emails. Super important to kind of create one place to save and store all of this information and back it up. Organize file names in chronological order or by concern, or maybe even by perpetrator. So again, in this kind of follow-up guide, since we don't have a ton of time today, I will link some resources for exactly how to document. It's just really important to create this trail of evidence, especially if you're experiencing kind of ongoing harassment. And there is a service called Page Vault that does offer documentation services for a fee, and it logs like all of the pertinent information, but it is a paid service. So at the very least, in this incident log that you create, make sure that it includes the date, what happened, that screenshot, the evidence that it happened, who you think did it, maybe their handle, the URL, if that's something that you want to save, and especially, take notes, note what happened and why it concerned you. Again, I'm going to send you some of these templates and document how you can create proper documentation in the follow-up to this session. But the reason I kind of share this is just to say it's super important to have a record of what happened. All right, then we move into the next section. So you've done the immediate steps, you're in a secure location, you've started to document the harassment. Maybe you've told someone, a trusted colleague or a friend about what's going on. Now you have some options. This is kind of where you think about your particular situation. And you should consider these right after you checked off the now steps. So it's not necessarily like right away, but these are things that are still quite urgent for you to decide in terms of response. So here's some examples that I just pulled directly from the various action plans. You might want to block or mute the offending person. Maybe you want to make private some social media accounts for a little bit until the incident is blowing over. You may want to report to the relevant platforms. You might want to consider reviewing your location settings. So on your app, are there any settings that are tracking your location or posting your location in addition to like when you upload something to Instagram, for example, and maybe even conduct a threat assessment. So here's kind of a little tip from a researcher who we did an interview with about a month or two ago on reporting to platforms. And this was done for a new action plan that we just put out on responding to online sexual harassment. So it's really helpful to look for the actual reporting forms on each of the platforms. Anything that can connect you with a content moderation specialist is helpful because it allows you to add a bit more context to the situation. And then I think this was a really great kind of note is that because you may be doxxed, it's also really important that you protect your personal identity in this process. And, I just should say too that, as you can see from this quote, reporting to platforms can be a really, really frustrating experience. I just want to recognize that. And it can be really difficult to get platforms to respond to your complaint and to your report. And oftentimes, as the case with Facebook, for example, it can be really difficult to even find a place or access a form that allows you to put in relevant context to demonstrate why you're concerned. So here are a couple tips that may help get your report noticed. So one thing you can do is you can rally your community. So something that I've been seeing on Twitter quite a lot is maybe asking people to report an impersonating account, rallying your community to reply to a harasser with positive context, tweets or messages. On Reddit, for example, you can ask your community to upvote your comments and again, leave positive messages. So there are a few ways that you can kind of rally your community, both in support of you, but also in reporting to platforms and getting attention from the platforms. So again, sending people to report offending content, posts, or accounts. Maybe you tag Jack and other Twitter executives to see if you can get attention on whatever situation that you're facing. If you are able to provide context, it's really important to get specific, but also be clear and concise. So why is this post concerning to you? So for example, it might be one comment might sound like really innocent to someone that doesn't have any context, but if you're able to add, hey, this person is has been following me and sending me messages on Instagram, and I'm also getting emails from them. I also know that they're a reader of my work. Like that paints a very different picture to a content moderator. And then, reach out to your network. Unfortunately, connections sometimes help. See if you know someone who knows someone that maybe works at the platform and can actually connect you to like a warm body at a platform. All right, blocking versus muting. What is the difference? So again, shout out to PEN America, I love them, and the IWMF Coalition, who put together this really great course on digital security for journalists. I bring up this slide just like super quickly to give an overview of the difference of blocking and muting, just because I think it's, I won't read it off exactly, but I think it's really important to kind of take stock of what some of the cons might be to each of them. So blocking is great because the person can't directly message you, they can't harass you from the blocked account, but this could also potentially escalate the harassment, could make them angry, maybe they create new accounts to harass you. And then on the other side, muting, okay, it's great that you don't have to see the content. Maybe you don't have to read the harassment itself. But if you're in a situation where you're concerned that the harassment might escalate, this can be a bit of a risk because you might not be able to see that escalation happening. So if you are muting content, I think it's really important to have someone who is at least monitoring your accounts, just to see if there is escalation, something new that comes up that you might need to take action on. And then assessing active risks. So I mentioned in kind of the checklist portion that one thing that can be really important and helpful to do is a threat assessment. And this is essentially a Q&A that helps you think through, what's at risk, what are you willing to do to mitigate that risk, and what is kind of like the context and the situation that you're facing. So a threat assessment can actually get much deeper than this, but these are just some really high level questions that I think like in the moment of an active situation can be really helpful to ask yourself, just to get a handle on what's happening. And this can also be useful for reporting later on, for the documentation piece. But maybe ask yourself, what tactics are being used against you? Is there any specific content or text of abuse that you want to make note of? What's the volume of abuse? This can be really important in terms of understanding like what is the risk of escalation, or is this a coordinated campaign against me? Are these bots, or are these, is this really like a group of real people that I need to take care of in terms of like reporting to the platforms or taking to law enforcement, for example? What's the source of the abuse? And then what's the timeline of the abuse? So again, is this a one-off incident? Is this something that's ongoing? So I think once you have some of the answers to these questions, it can really paint a much richer picture of what's going on and what you think the next steps should be. So I know we're kind of starting to run up on time, so I'll kind of go through these next sections a little bit quicker, but I think the key, like the now and the next section, is just really important because it is securing your physical safety and getting a handle on what's happening. These other pieces are really more, okay, the incident sort of peak, even if it's ongoing, maybe you have a bit of a handle on what's happening to you. These are questions and considerations for what really makes the most sense for you and your situation. So just things that you should walk through and think about. And they don't necessarily work for everyone. So here's some examples. Maybe you choose to take a break. It's totally okay to step away from the news for a little bit. I know it's really hard, and I just want to recognize that a lot of people are in situations, especially, this is like peak election season. Reporting is nonstop, it's fast paced, and I know you're always on, but it's okay to completely step away. If that means 30 minutes for you, that's great. If that's a whole day and you can do it, then that's great too. There's nothing to feel bad or guilty about. You can also request help from trusted friends or peers. And this ties into monitoring communications. But if the situation is overwhelming for you, if looking at the content or the harassment is re-traumatizing you and it's too much, please request help from friends or peers or even trusted colleagues to monitor communication so that you can kind of just like take a step back, take a breather. This can be hugely helpful in just creating a little bit of space between you and the harassment, and so you can kind of consider what you want to do next. Some things that you can do in terms of like community support, and again, this kind of ties into that asking a trusted friend or colleague to step in for you. But like I said before, you can also ask followers. Maybe you don't know people, but you have a readership that's willing to step up and support you with likes, positive comments, or helping you report or monitor your accounts. I've even seen people, in these kinds of situations, people that they don't even know being like, hey, I'm happy to help you report things. You might be surprised if you just ask for help. And something else that we've seen that really helps is joining a WhatsApp group or a listserv or another community with other journalists that people might know what you're going through. So we talked to a freelance investigative journalist who, she told us during one of her situations, she had a small WhatsApp group that she was able to message about what was going on. And she said, having a group of colleagues you can vent to is a huge balm. Most of my colleagues had gone through similar, if not worse, and simply sharing made me feel better. So, it doesn't even have to be asking for help necessarily or having people step in, but sometimes it's just having someone to share the experience with. And, that kind of goes to the first step of like letting someone know what's going on. Even that can be a huge relief, and I think can be really important in sort of protecting yourself and being able to recover and process these kinds of situations. Finally, there's consider. And again, these kind of vary and switch around depending on what action plan you're in. But they're all just questions that would be useful to think through in a particular time frame after an incident. So these are good to know suggestions, and do this when there's some space between you and the initial incident. So it's not like an immediate decision that you have to make, but just when you have, maybe after you've taken that short break, that you've stepped back for a second and like, okay, I know what's going on. I've rallied my community. What should I think about next? So you might consider, do you want to speak out or not? Do you want to contact an attorney or seek legal support or advice? Do you want or need to seek mental health services? What do you really need to recover, to like move forward, continue your work, and feel safe? And finally, future, this is a section that we actually just added in the new action plans. And this is part of that process of really going back to the preparedness. So you've been able to respond, you're processing and recovering. Okay, what have you learned and what can you do to be prepared if should something else happen in the future, or even to help someone else out? So these are extra steps to take, extra suggestions to take when you have time, once you actually have breathing room, you're really ready to recover. And so this might be, going back to some of the securing or scrubbing your digital presence, developing secure communications with sources, protecting yourself there in that way. Maybe you contact your professional association, NABJ, AAJA, etc., union or civil society organization, like Online SOS or Coalition for Women Journalists, etc. if you need additional support. And because all of these organizations, they have resources, they give trainings, some even provide legal support and emergency funds to journalists that need it. All right, so that was the action plan. That's kind of the core tool. And like I said, every action plan is a little bit different, but they'll more or less be organized in that format. Or they each have those sections, but the actual suggestions within each section might be a little bit different depending on the situation. And that's because they're really tailored to the type of harassment that you're facing. So recovery basics, some self-care tips, and like I said, kind of going back to preparedness and being able to both help yourself next time or help others as well. So really improving like digital security and things like that. A couple self-care tips during high stress news events, AKA now, although basically all the time, really in the 24/7 news cycle, I think. And again, I just want to recognize these are just some tips that can really help. I understand that these might be easier said than done sometimes, especially when you're expected to churn out pieces or you're a freelancer and you're pitching and writing, etc., like nonstop in this period. But you can get uninterrupted sleep. Try to distance yourself from negative users. Again, allow yourself to kind of take that break. Reach out to friends or peers. Leave the news and devices behind, like even for an hour, just uninterrupted, non-phone, non-screen time. Get a professional involved, so maybe a mental health services counselor. Maybe you have I think this could even be like a digital security expert that can you can sit down with them and get one-on-one advice, and maybe that even feels like more direct support. And then also indulge in creativity, however brief. So this kind of ties into the number 4, leave the news and devices behind. I've really loved collaging recently, and it's made me completely forget about my phone because I'm too focused on cutting things out of magazines. And then this is back to the kind of the preparedness, consider risk assessments and security audits on a regular basis when you can. That includes maybe before assignments, maybe schedule quarterly account audits, like, hey, what are all the accounts that I have open right now? And are the passwords secure for that? Is my information too public on that one, etc. And in the follow-up to this session, in that one pager that I'll send you, I'll also send you kind of a little cheat sheet for that. And then I also really encourage you to follow accounts or sign up for newsletters from these various civil society organizations, PEN America, IWMF, Committee to Protect Journalists, your local, your journalist associations. There's tons and tons of great info out there, and I really encourage you to connect with those communities because, the other thing that I just really want you to get out of this is that you're not alone in this, and that there is support out there for you if you are experiencing online harassment.